My name is Dan. I'm the customer learning and development consultant here at RightCapital. As always, thank you for taking the time out of your Friday to join me here for this presentation. I'm excited to be here with you today. We're going to be touching on a topic that I love talking about, which is retirement spending strategies. So this is a topic, that we at RightCapital feel is an important part of the planning conversation, especially considering that some other planning tools out there treat retirement spending as a relatively simple input, something that's either static or maybe just increasing out into the future with, a simple general inflation rate. And while this can certainly be done in Right Capital, we also understand, that this is not the reality for many clients. And something that our software excels at is modeling changes in retirement spending over time. And Right Capital gives you a lot of control over these changes depending on what you want to see within the plan. We can see retirement expenses taper off over time. We can reduce expenses at certain intervals to better reflect behavioral and lifestyle changes that might occur during someone's retirement years. And we can even model strategies that are more directly tied to projected market performance within a plan. So, for some folks, retirement spending might be a little bit more reactionary, and we have a couple strategies in particular that will actually dynamically adjust based on a variety of potential market conditions and what's actually happening year to year within a plan. And we can analyze the impact of all of these strategies within the context of the Monte Carlo simulation or specific return scenarios with specific sequences of return. So, depending on the needs of your clients and the complexity of the plan that you're building, Right Capital scales with you when it comes to retirement spending. So, yeah, let's just take a brief look over our agenda here before we dive in for today. We're going to start by taking a quick look at retirement spending strategies within a client plan in Right Capital so that we all understand where they're implemented and what your options are. We're then going to dive into the advisor portal and actually walk through an explanation of each strategy and exactly how it works so that you can confidently model these strategies in your plans with a more complete understanding of, what they're actually doing and why. We'll then touch on how you can customize the parameters for existing strategies and also create your own custom strategies that might, better align with the actual recommendations that you're making day to day. And we'll round things out today by highlighting some tips and best practices, including a few settings to be aware of, as well as a few new charts that can help illustrate what these strategies are doing with a bit more visual clarity. So a lot of ground to cover here today. So I am going to dive into Right Capital. Bear with me just a moment as I switch screens here. But as I'm doing this, I do just want to quickly remind everyone, firstly, that these webinars are recorded, and we will be posting the recording of this webinar on our Help Center shortly after. So I will, of course, at the end of the presentation, show everyone where you can find that recording if you'd like to watch this back. And I also want to let, especially those that are new to Right Capital, know that our webinars are always interactive as well, and there will be a live Q&A at the end of the presentation today. So if you do have any questions at all, feel free to write in. You should find a Q&A field in the Zoom control panel on your screen. I will be sticking around to answer as many questions as time allows for. So like I said, feel free to write in. I'm here to help however I can. All right. So first things first here, we're going to start by diving into a client plan and taking a quick look at where retirement spending strategies are modeled in Right Capital. So let's open up our plan here for Jesse and Leslie. This is going to be our case study for today. And there are actually two locations where retirement spending strategies can be selected and applied within a client plan. And for those of you that have been with us for a while, you may already be familiar with this concept, but for those of you that are new, we can choose between spending strategies in both the profile area as well as within the retirement analysis area of a plan. And the main difference here depends on whether we want that strategy to be applied to the client's current plan or to their proposed plan. So let's start by looking at the profile. This is where we can incorporate a spending strategy into the client's current plan. And in particular, this can be done in the profile goals area within the retirement living expense card here. So the one labeled retirement expense. So again, for those of you that are new, the profile is essentially our baseline information within the plan. So everything that we set here within the profile area is going to determine the strategy for the client's current plan. And within this card, you have the ability not only to enter the client's monthly expenses, their average living expenses, we can also choose to select a retirement spending strategy here. And these are going to feed in again to the current plan that we'll see in just a moment once we pivot into the retirement analysis section. So you can see the 5 options here on my screen: inflation adjusted, spending smile and spending stages, as well as guardrails and floor and ceiling. So we're going to dive into all of these a little bit more in depth in just a few minutes here. I mentioned that in addition to setting these strategies in the profile area, you can also choose between these strategies in the retirement analysis area. So the main difference here again is that whatever we choose in the profile is going to feed into the client's current plan on the right here, and that's going to be the foundation for the proposal as well. But within the action items at the bottom of this page, we can specifically choose to implement a different retirement spending strategy within the proposed plan in particular. And this gives us the ability to set up a side-by-side before and after comparison, where we can take a look at the client's plan with one strategy on the right and another strategy on the left, and see, the direct impact that that strategy will have on their plan big picture. So with that, we've set the stage here. The next thing that I want to do is take a deeper dive into each of the options that you see listed here on my screen. Like I said, there are 5 different spending strategies to choose from by default in RightCapital, and really understanding how each of these works can be an important tool in your toolkit as an advisor. So for this, I actually want to open up a new tab here and visit the advisor portal. And we're going to dive into the models area in particular. So I'm going to leave the client plan open in a separate tab because we are going to be bouncing back and forth today a little bit. But to take a look at the spending strategies, you can, in your advisor portal, click into the models tab at the top here, and then click into the retirement spending area of the models tab. So this page is where we can find a little bit more information about all of the existing strategies that we offer here at RightCapital. So, the first one that you see on my screen being inflation adjusted. We'll start with this one. This is the most simple retirement spending strategy that we offer here. And I do always like to mention that this is also the default spending strategy in RightCapital. So unless you've changed the strategy either at a global level or on a client specific level, this will be in place by default. So as you can see here, this strategy takes the retirement living expenses that are entered for a client, again, in that profile goals area within that retirement expense card, and it's going to increase those expenses each year according to your general inflation rate. So this is a very linear projection when it comes to retirement expenses. And again, this is tied specifically to your general inflation rate that you set. So the main thing I want to iterate or to highlight here when it comes to this strategy is just where you can set the general inflation rate, both at a global level and at a client-specific level, just because these are tied directly. So within the advisor area here, if you wanted to double check or adjust what you're using for your general inflation rate, feel free to click into the assumptions area within the more menu here, and you'll be able to find that in the inflation tab. So by default in RightCapital, we use 2.5% as the general inflation rate. So by default, living expenses in retirement will increase each year by 2.5%. But feel free to adjust this depending on what you'd like to see within your client plans, and that will update accordingly. I mentioned you can also change this at a client specific level. So let's dive back into that plan for a moment and we can touch on that as well. So within each and every client household, you can also click into the gear icon settings tab in the upper right, and you'll have the ability in the other assumptions tab here to adjust that general inflation rate just for these clients. So in this case, just for Jesse and Leslie here, we can choose to use a customized rate rather than that global rate we've set of 2.5%. So depending on what you want to see, either at a global level or a client specific level, you always have the flexibility to make those adjustments. All right. So the next strategy that we're going to dive into for today is the spending smile. So If we click on that here, it will actually give us a little description, and that's going to be true for all of these spending strategies. So that can be helpful if you're looking to learn a bit more about these. So when it comes to the spending smile, there is some overlap here. Living expenses will still be adjusted by general inflation. The main difference being we can choose to subtract a specified percentage from that general inflation rate. So this strategy is sometimes referred to as the Blanchett spending smile, coined by David Blanchett. And this approach is based on the premise that, as folks age, they're actually prone to spending a bit less. Most retirees spend more early in retirement, and that sort of tapers off as they start to, check off some of those bucket list items and as they maybe start to slow down a bit as they get older. So, research seems to suggest that retirement spending decreases for most folks at a rate of somewhere between 1 and 2% per year. So the default in Right Capital is 1%. And actually, we can take a look at this within our client plan and sort of visually see the impact of that reduction happening. For this, there is a very specific chart that I like to use that helps to provide a little bit of visual clarity when it comes to seeing the impact of these spending strategies. So once this loads here, folks, we're going to click into the retirement details area of the retirement analysis. And then in particular, I like to use the retirement spending chart here for the proposed plan. So this chart by default will highlight all of the different spending categories, between living expenses, housing, etc. You can actually choose to hide certain expenses here and just zero in on the retirement expenses, which can be really useful if you're looking to just pinpoint the impact of those spending strategies in particular. So here we see, at the moment, we just have that. Actually, we do already have the spending smile applied here, but if we switch it back to inflation adjusted for a moment, we can see sort of that linear projection if we just isolate those retirement expenses, and we can see, our starting point here, and we can watch that increase each year according to that general inflation rate. But again, if you switch to the spending smile here for the proposed plan and then click refresh, we'll see, some changes in this chart. We'll actually see a slower decrease in the expenses. And you can sort of think of this as just your general inflation rate minus 1%. So in this case, 2.5% minus 1. So our expenses are increasing by 1.5% each year. So we see a lesser increase here. So again, it doesn't really show in this chart in particular, but the reason this is called a spending smile is because of the relationship between retirement living expenses and retirement healthcare costs. And the data there sort of shows that, while non-medical spending tends to decrease steadily, healthcare costs tend to increase, especially in the later years. So there's sort of an inverse relationship between the two. And if we combine both here, this is a bit of a drastic example because I do have long-term care occurring in the later years here. But when we do combine both, we can sort of see, that smile a little bit more clearly here. The non-medical spending tapering off in the earlier years, and then, that higher increase for healthcare costs as time goes on. All right, so we are going to dive into the next one here. After the spending smile, the next option is the retirement spending stages. I've heard some folks refer to this as the go-go, slow-go, no-go spending strategy, which is a great name. But, essentially that, name considers the approach of, the different activity levels of retirees based on their age. So this one is the one I mentioned that's a little bit more reflective of some of those lifestyle changes. Typically, most folks are more active in the early years of retirement, which would be the go-go phase. Activities tends to slow down, as well as spending as clients age, which is that slow go phase. And then, at some point, activities are essentially reduced to a minimum level, in the latest stage of retirement as we approach the final years of the plan. So, compared to the more linear options we've looked at so far, this is potentially a more realistic approach that sort of takes into consideration a client's behavioral and lifestyle changes and the impact on their expenses as they age. So something that I do want to mention here is that expenses will still increase with general inflation each year, but along with that, we will see a dip in expenses, a reduction at certain ages. And by default, that's going to be a 10% reduction at age 75, and then another 5% reduction at age 85. So this is another one that we can see very clearly back in the plan using this retirement spending chart in the retirement area. So let's remove healthcare costs. Let's apply that spending stages chart and refresh here. Again, we may need to hide the rest of these expenses, but here we can actually see some of those dips occurring. If we hover our mouse over the chart, we can see that first dip at age 75. We can see a second dip at age 85. And if you're curious what this last little dip is, that's actually an expense adjustment occurring as a result of the older client in this plan passing away first. There's a setting that will reduce living expenses by a certain percentage when one client passes away within a joint plan. So that's what we see occurring here towards the very end of the plan. So we have those various stages, the go-go phase, the slow-go phase, and then the no-go phase towards the end, in addition to that inflation adjustment on top of that. All right, so for these last two strategies that we're going to touch on here today, we have some more unique strategies which, to my knowledge, some other planning tools out there don't really offer. These are strategies that will actually react to the different market conditions that we throw at them within the Monte Carlo analysis. So, these are strategies that might better reflect the actual recommendations that you find yourselves making to clients as they experience volatile markets. So let's start with the guardrails strategy here. This is also known as the Guyton-Klinger decision rules, so you may have heard that name instead. And this is a retirement spending framework that's designed to be a little bit more dynamic. The idea here is that we want clients to be able to increase their quality of life and spend a bit more when markets are performing well, but we also want to have a plan in place to sort of button down the hatches when markets take a downturn. So we have a few different components that we're looking at here when it comes to how this strategy works. The first piece here is the inflation adjustment. And this gives you the ability to say, if a client's portfolio return is negative in a given year, we will not see an inflation adjustment on their retirement expenses. So this is a unique feature of this strategy, compared to something like the other strategies we've looked at that will, always increase spending along with inflation, even in poor market conditions. And you can toggle this on and off, depending on whether or not you want this to occur as a part of this strategy. The next two components here are our actual guardrails. We have our capital preservation rule here, as well as our prosperity rule. So the capital preservation rule is our upper guardrail. This is the one that reduces spending. And the prosperity rule is the lower guardrail, which actually increases spending. And rather than simply looking at portfolio return, these rules actually look to the client's withdrawal rate in each year of retirement up until a certain point, which by default is age 80. So that's sort of the last piece here, is this initial withdrawal rate, and that sort of ties all of this together. So RightCapital will actually calculate the client's initial withdrawal rate in the year that they retire, and that initial withdrawal rate will be used as the basis to calculate the rate for our upper and lower guardrails. So by default, again, that'll be set to 20% above or below that initial withdrawal rate. So this one is a little bit more nuanced, folks. I was actually planning to wait until the end today to showcase some of the new charts that we recently added, but I think I'm actually going to work those in to the presentation now as a way to maybe demonstrate a bit more visually the mechanics of what's happening here with the guardrails strategy. So the first thing I want to mention, these are actually new charts as of relatively recently. If you're selecting either the guardrails or the floor and ceiling strategy in the proposal here in RightCapital, or even in the current plan, as long as it's being implemented, you'll actually have the ability, again, here in the retirement details page, to select some new charts that specifically highlight the impact of these strategies in particular. So these can be a little tricky to see, the exact mechanics of what's happening in some of these other charts and in the cash flows. So these new charts really go a long way in helping to better understand the relationship between, in this case, the guardrails that we're setting and the changes that might trigger as a result of those to the expenses in the plan. So in this case, we have an example of a situation where the clients are retiring at age 65. On the left here, we can actually see the withdrawal rate for each and every year of the plan. And in that first year of retirement, we can see that the initial withdrawal rate is 3.51%. So this is what's being used again as the initial withdrawal rate. That is the basis for our capital preservation and prosperity rules. And it also helps in this chart to actually see the guardrails in terms of the percentage. So we can see here, based on that initial rate of 3.51, the upper guardrail at 4.2 and the lower guardrail at 2.8. So 20% above and below that initial withdrawal rate. And as we sort of take a look here at the client's year-to-year withdrawal rates that we're projecting going forward, we can see, when they dip below that lower guardrail, we actually have some increases in spending. So we can see here that, in year one at age 66, we're still within those guardrails, so no changes there. But at 67, we do dip below that lower guardrail. And if we take a look at the chart on the right here, we can see that in response to that, in the following year, we actually see a bigger increase in retirement spending. So you can sort of get a sense here of the relationship between the withdrawal rate and the changes to the client's spending, depending on whether they're exceeding that upper threshold or dipping below that lower threshold. We can see again later on here, once they re-enter the guardrails corridor there, we can see that increase actually going away and sort of the normal trajectory based on general inflation resuming for a while. So again, this can be a great visual to sort of understand yourself, but also explain to clients a little bit more clearly how changes to their withdrawal rate actually correlate to changes in their retirement expenses when using this strategy. All right, folks, I do want to dive next into the floor and ceiling strategy, which is the last strategy here that we're going to be touching on. This one operates on a similar premise, but it does function a little bit differently from guardrails. So I do want to talk about both the similarities and the differences here. The main similarity here is that both of these strategies are reacting to market conditions in the sense that we're increasing spending when they're doing well and decreasing spending when they're not. But in terms of how they actually work at a mechanical level, they are actually pretty different. So just to reiterate again, guardrails is really looking at that client's withdrawal rate each year. And we only see changes in spending when one of those rules, one of those guardrails rules is triggered. The floor and ceiling, however, does not look to withdrawal rate, but rather an initial expense rate. So you can see a retirement expense rate here is going to be calculated within the plan. So we're looking at something a little bit different here when it comes to this strategy. This is another one that I find maybe diving into the client plan here can help demonstrate what's happening. So first things first, let's apply that floor and ceiling strategy to this plan. This one again will unlock for us a new chart that's dedicated specifically to the floor and ceiling spending strategy. So I actually also want to take a quick peek at the cash flows here as well, just so we can understand, how that initial expense rate is being calculated, because that is sort of an important component here. So first and foremost, we can see again these clients retiring at age 65 here. And this will show us the client's retirement expenses, their annual expenses in that first year of retirement. So we can see here for these clients, that's 143,879. And of course, that is inflation adjusted. Those are future dollars we're looking at here. When it comes to that initial expense rate, really all we're doing is taking this expense amount in year one of retirement and dividing that by the client's invested assets at the beginning of that year. So if we take a look at our cash flows, specifically the invested asset tab, we can find that same year where those clients are retiring. We can see the invested asset balance at the beginning of that year, which is a little over 6 million. And what we get when we take that expense amount and divide it by that $6 million asset figure is an initial expense rate of around 2.4%. So obviously I'm rounding here, but the actual calculation is going to use many more decimal places than that. And that initial expense rate of 2.4% is what will be used to calculate the client's living expenses each year going forward within the plan. So this is important. Rather than adjusting a client's expenses each year by inflation, like our other strategies, we're actually going to look at their total invested assets at the beginning of each of these years and then multiply that by that initial expense rate, which again, for this client is 2.4%. So, I have some of this math done in advance for me in my notes here, but if we take a look at, year two, we see a different expense amount here. And actually, if we dive back into the cash flows for a moment, we have this client's age 66. We have a higher invested asset value of $6.2 million here. And if we take this by that, multiplied by that 2.4% rate, that's going to give us, this $150,000 expense amount. And we're going to rinse and repeat that process for each and every year here. So in this case, it looks like the client's portfolio is doing pretty well. So we're seeing some higher increases in spending to go along with that. So again, just to stress the difference here, with the guardrail strategy, we only see changes to a client's retirement expenses if they exceed or drop below the upper or lower guardrails, which triggers the preservation and prosperity rules. But with this strategy, the client's retirement expenses fluctuate each and every year along with their invested assets as they either grow or dwindle. So the final piece of this puzzle then is the actual floor and ceiling, as the name sort of suggests here. So, these are the limits, the upper and lower limits that prevent us from swinging too far in either direction as a result of either more extreme market fluctuations on the high end or the low end. So we can say, in years of down markets, or rather if the client's portfolio isn't doing so well, let's limit our spending reduction to 15% below the initial retirement expense amount, adjusted for inflation, of course. That's another important component here. So, and then, in years where maybe the client's assets are experiencing more growth than expected, let's limit the spending increase to 20%, so our spending doesn't get too out of control. And once again, that new floor and ceiling chart really comes a long way or goes a long way here in just demonstrating how that's working within the plan. And we can actually see here in year one, again, that retirement expense amount being used as a way to determine the floor and ceiling. We can see those being calculated based on that amount, and those both increasing going forward by that general inflation rate. So, just to summarize here, now that we've looked at our 5 spending strategies, these are all options that you have within a plan to, essentially, find areas of opportunity and to, not only model more accurate retirement expenses within a plan, but also to make sure that your clients can essentially have a higher probability of success when navigating turbulent markets. And just to reiterate something that we touched on in the beginning, you can choose to implement these strategies in a client's current plan within the profile, as well as the proposed plan here, like we've been doing as part of, within the retirement analysis. So something that some advisors like to do, or at least something that I've seen advisors do in my personal experience, is choose to implement something like that retirement spending smile or retirement spending stages within the current plan, those being the models that are maybe a little bit more realistic, based on hard data or lifestyle and behavioral changes that we generally know to be true for most people as they age. So those are more commonly selected, I'd say, here in the current plan. And then, in the retirement analysis area where we're modeling a proposal for a client, that's where we can maybe implement something like that guardrails strategy or that floor and ceiling strategy, if that's something we want to recommend, of course. And so for our proposal, we're implementing strategies that do react a bit more dynamically to market conditions. And in that way, for plans that might be struggling a bit, we can hopefully improve their probability of success by limiting spending during down markets. And for clients like this one that maybe are projected to do pretty well, we can grant them a little leeway with their spending and improve their quality of life while still maintaining a probability of success that we're comfortable with. So that's a deep dive into each of the spending strategies, folks. I will just say, if you do want to recap on anything we just covered, there is a help center link on the left here with more information on all 5 of these strategies. So feel free to take a look at our help center. We'll touch a little bit more towards the end of the presentation today on resources, advisor resources, but do keep in mind that this is here for you when you need it. All right, so there are a couple more things that I want to touch on, folks, before transitioning into the Q&A for today. Now, you may have already noticed this today as we've been looking through the spending strategies here, but an important piece of the puzzle here is that you have the flexibility to make changes to the parameters for all of these spending strategies in RightCapital to better align them with your preferences and your unique advising philosophy. So within the models tab here in the advisor area, as you click through all of these spending strategies in your RightCapital account, you'll find that you're able to make adjustments to all of these values that we're using to calculate something like the floor and ceiling, or something like the thresholds for the adjustments for the guardrails. You can make changes to all of this, and that will reflect within your client plans when you use these strategies. So, a couple common examples maybe. I mentioned before that when it comes to something like the spending smile, for most folks, that reduction is somewhere between 1% and 2% each year. So the default in RightCapital is a 1% reduction, but if you wanted to use a 2%, you're more than welcome to. Maybe you want to split the difference and use a 1.5% reduction. Feel free to adjust this depending on how dramatic you want that reduction to be for the spending smile. Another common example that I've seen working with advisors is for the guardrails, choosing to, instead of using the initial withdrawal rate in year 1 of retirement for each specific client, you actually have the ability to overwrite the initial withdrawal rate with a specific rate. And the reason I point this out in particular, a lot of advisors do like to use 4% here as a way to represent that, that more general 4% rule when it comes to withdrawals in retirement. And in this case, if we were to change that to 4%, rather than looking at this specific client's withdrawal rate in year 1 of retirement, so rather than, I believe it was 3.5%, we're just going to use 4% as the initial rate for the guardrails. So that can be a helpful way to sort of streamline these strategies in a way that maybe better aligns with what you want to see. Something I also want to point out here is that in addition to adjusting the values for existing strategies, you can also create brand new spending strategies here. So maybe, if you don't want to touch the existing strategies, creating new strategies can be a great alternative. So maybe, we want to leave the, default guardrail strategy be, and then maybe create a separate strategy for that 4% rule. That's absolutely something that we can do here. If you click add a spending strategy, it's going to add a new strategy here on the left. You can name these strategies whatever you'd like. So maybe we do want to call this one 4% rule. We can then choose which strategy type we'd like to use as the foundation for this custom strategy. So again, maybe in this case, we want to select that guardrails option. And then for this, we can choose to use that overridden withdrawal rate of 4%. And maybe we even want to set different thresholds in terms of, the upper and lower guardrails. Maybe rather than 20%, we want to use 25%, just to make things a little cleaner in the plan. And, once we change all these values and choose to save this strategy in the lower right, this will become available for us to use across all of our client plans. So if I refresh my page here, we'll find that this is actually a strategy that we can now implement within our case study here for Jesse and Leslie. So if I scroll back down to the action items, we'll now find the 4% rule listed along with those other strategies. And if we click refresh, we'll be able to see the impact of our new custom strategy. So again, maybe let's take a look at that guardrails chart here, and we can see, even with a specific initial rate of 3.51 for these clients, our upper and lower guardrails based on our custom parameters are 3% and 5%, using that 4% as the initial rate and then 25% higher and lower. So, that's just a common example that I've sometimes seen advisors use here. Another common example, just to round this out, comes with the retirement spending stages, something that I occasionally find advisors looking to model is specifically a reduction in living expenses when long-term care kicks in within a client plan. So, again, maybe just to demonstrate this a little more clearly, in this plan, we can see long-term care kicking in for the last, 4 or 5 years here for these clients. And, by default, retirement living expenses won't automatically drop along with long-term care costs when those kick in, but you can certainly create a custom spending stages strategy designed to reduce living expenses when long-term care kicks in. So again, just to maybe walk through that here, we can set up that new custom strategy, call it whatever we'd like. And then, for something like this, maybe we even want to ignore the first stage here by setting the expense adjustment to 0. And then maybe for the final 5 years or so of the plan, we want to see, maybe a more dramatic reduction to sort of offset the long-term care expenses that are kicking in, whether that's maybe 30%, maybe 40%, whatever you'd like to set here. And again, once we save this, we'll be able to use that within our client plans, both in the retirement analysis section here, as well as within the profile for the client's current plan. So again, lots of flexibility here to model whatever you'd like to see when it comes to these spending strategies. All right. So just to wrap things up here today, I do want to touch on a handful of tips and best practices that are useful to keep in mind when it comes to modeling retirement spending strategies in RightCapital. This is the point where I was going to mention those two new charts, but we did already touch on those. So again, if you choose the floor and ceiling or guardrail strategies for a specific client, you will have access to those, corresponding charts here for, depending on what you're using in that plan, within the retirement details tab of the retirement analysis. So those are great charts if you're looking to better understand, how those strategies are impacting the expenses within a plan. I do also want to mention the fact that you can change the default retirement spending strategy at a global level in RightCapital. So you may remember I mentioned before that inflation adjusted by default is what will be in place to start for new clients in RightCapital. But maybe you're someone who would rather use something like the spending smile or the spending stages as the default whenever you create a new client plan in RightCapital. So if you are one of those advisors, if you'd like to make that kind of change, do know that you can always click into the client settings tab, which may be located within the more menu here, like it is for me. You may also see it at the top here, depending on your account. So within client settings, you'll want to click into the client presets tab here. And if we scroll down a little bit to the plan parameters section, this is where you can actually update your default spending strategy. So what do you want to be the assumption? Whenever you create a new client plan, what do you want to be in place as a starting point? So if you wanted to use the spending smile, for instance, you could choose to select that here and then click save. The main thing to note about the client presets page here in RightCapital is that this won't actually change the settings for any of your existing client plans. So selecting the spending smile here won't impact any of my existing clients that I've already created in my client list. It will, however, impact all new clients that I create going forward. So if I just create a new client here quickly, we'll be able to see actually, if I just skip ahead to the goals step of the initial data entry, that the default spending strategy now, rather than being inflation adjusted, is the spending smile. So if you wanted to make that kind of change, it's very quick and easy to do so within the area I just highlighted in the advisor portal, that being client settings, client presets. All right, I do want to touch on a handful of settings to be aware of as well that may have an impact when it comes to retirement spending strategies in RightCapital. So I'm going to click back into our case study for today, and I'm going to pivot into the settings quickly. So the first thing I want to mention is your return assumptions. So these can actually have a pretty big impact on the output, especially when it comes to something like the guardrails or the floor and ceiling strategies that are a little bit more tied to market performance. So, the main thing to keep in mind here is that, what we're looking at in terms of growth when it comes to these different asset classes for clients, is based on your return assumptions that you're using. And again, depending on your assumptions, you might find that the floor and ceiling or guardrail strategies will behave differently, depending on whether those are a little bit more aggressive or a little bit more conservative. So something to note, especially if you're using the presets that we offer for assumptions in RightCapital. I'm currently using the historical return assumptions as my global preset for return assumptions. You may notice that these are on the more optimistic side in terms of total return. So, when we're taking a look at something like the floor and ceiling strategy, for instance, let's dial that in one more time and just take another look at that chart to really hammer this home here. So when using the floor and ceiling, in this case, we actually see some pretty optimistic projections. So, that in this case comes along with increases in the client's spending to go along with, growth on their assets over time. However, I will note that the forward-looking assumptions preset, which is curated by JP Morgan, is quite a bit more conservative than the historical assumptions. And we did actually update both of these presets recently to reflect, the current year's projections, current year's values. And it seems, based on at least the last year or two, that the gap between these two is continuing to widen. The historical assumptions are slowly creeping a little bit higher, while the forward-looking tends to be creeping downward in terms of total returns. So I would say just to be mindful of the assumptions you're using. And even if I switch over to the forward-looking assumptions here and maybe refresh my screen, we might see a different story when it comes to the floor and ceiling strategy. So let's take a quick look here at that chart one more time. And as we can see here, rather than increasing expenses to the point where we're actually hitting that ceiling after a couple of years, we actually see smaller increases in retirement spending as a result of those lower assumptions based on those JP Morgan assumptions presets. So again, just something to be mindful of. This will vary depending on your assumptions. Other than the presets, you of course have the ability to fully customize your assumptions, but I do always like just to highlight the impact of the return assumptions when it comes to something like those guardrails and floor and ceiling strategies. The very last thing I want to mention here today, folks, before transitioning into the Q&A is the planning method setting. So this is another setting in RightCapital to be mindful of in general, but when it comes to, these strategies we've touched on today, there's a specific thing to look out for that, our support team tends to get questions on. So if you're finding yourself in the retirement section, making changes to the spending strategy here, and maybe the impact isn't quite as substantial as you were expecting. Maybe you're making changes to the strategy and the probability of success isn't really changing, the ending assets aren't really changing. I would say if that's taking place, the first thing I would check would be the planning method. And the reason that that tends to happen is if you have the modified cash flow based planning method selected, this option does assume that any excess cash flows are being spent off by default. The reason that that's important for our purposes here today is if you're working with a client that maybe is a high earner and maybe their income, their cash inflows are higher than their cash outflows pretty consistently throughout the duration of the plan. In those cases, if you're using a modified cash flow based planning method, you may see positive numbers in the spend unsaved cash flows column here. And that's actually indicating that we're spending off that excess income every year. So we're assuming that the clients are finding a way to spend that excess, and that's essentially going out the door. And the reason that's relevant for our purposes today is even if you're modeling changes to a client's living expenses, if they're spending off the excess anyways, sometimes that doesn't, that'll translate to no change taking place within the plan itself because there's no extra being saved and reinvested. And we're assuming that that's all being spent off regardless of how much excess we have. So that does happen sometimes. So I will say if you ever are in that scenario and those spending strategies just aren't quite doing what you're expecting them to do, just double check that planning method and you should be good to go. All right. So that does cover it for the prepared content that I had for you today, folks. I am going to transition into the Q&A here and start addressing some of your questions. As I'm pulling up this list of questions on my other screen here, I do want to quickly just mention that if you have any lingering questions going forward about spending strategies or really anything else in Right Capital, always feel free to take a look at our Help Center. This is a great resource for you, and we have a lot of resources dedicated to retirement spending strategies in particular. So we've got articles, training videos, frequently asked questions, and more. These are all here for you if and when you need them to really take a deeper dive into everything we've touched on here today. I do also just want to quickly mention our support resources. So, if it looks like we got quite a lot of questions today, so, I'm going to do my best to address all of them, but if I'm not able to get to your question, feel free to reach out to our support team immediately after this presentation ends here today. They'll be available until 6 p.m. Eastern time, so they'll be happy to address any lingering questions you might have today or at any point in the future. So our support team's always available for you as well.